All right, hi everybody. We're going to use this video to talk about royal absolutism, continuing what we started to talk about in class on early modern Europe between about 1500 down to say about 1789, or end of the 18th century, when the French Revolution gets started, and we move into a different period of the modern era there. So here, turning to politics and thinking about particularly what monarchy means and how monarchy works in the early modern period. Coming out of the Middle Ages, medieval kingship had had a lot of limitations on it. Medieval kings had reached a real low point back around, 1000, 1100 AD or so, as far as where they stood in the overall distribution of power. They had wealth and they had people who would fight for them. Excuse me. Sorry, dealing with a little bit of a cold here. So, and of course, they had the prestige of kingship, and that gave them a lot of power. But there were some important limitations that they worked under. One was that the nobles were quite powerful. We talked about this beforehand when we talked about the significance of gunpowder. A nobleman could build castle walls around his home. He had knights and soldiers of his own. He had quite a bit of wealth. And those castle walls, in effect, really meant that powerful nobles could defy kings fairly readily. Medieval kings were not in a position where they could simply dictate to the nobility of their kingdoms. They had to get cooperation, and if the nobles had their own interests, which they often did, the nobles could act quite independently and disregard the actions of kings, or the will of the kings that were theoretically their lords. This did vary, and in the later Middle Ages, for a number of reasons, you see kings gradually recovering their power and becoming stronger, but overall, medieval kings were fairly weak, owing to the limitations placed on them by the nobles. The other thing is that the power of the Christian Church also was a significant limiting factor in the power of kings. We saw this beforehand, how there's quite a bit of push and pull, and how kings could indeed push back against popes or churchmen who demanded too much or pushed them too hard, but nevertheless the fact is that medieval kings claimed to rule by the grace of God, a phrase I'll talk about in a moment, and so you really wanted to have the cooperation and the support of the church because that gave you a certain sense of legitimacy in the eyes of the public at large, of the nobles and commoners and so forth, and you really didn't want to lose that sense of legitimacy, you didn't want to lose that sense of divine favor, because that would just make everything harder, right? It would sort of cause people to question you a lot, defy you a lot more, challenge you more often. If you could have strong confidence that you were indeed ruling properly, that would ease the task of ruling considerably, and so you wanted the church's support in order to be able to do that. That phrase that I mentioned, a king by the grace of God, really encapsulates the religious dimension of medieval kingship. That word grace refers to God's favor in a sense which implies that it's not earned, it's not deserved, it's not a right one has a claim to. It's simply God, out of God's benevolence, chooses to favor kings, favor certain people by elevating to the kingship. And so it underlines a sense of dependency, sort of that the king needs God, the king is dependent on God, the king needs to retain God's favor if God is going to continue holding him in power as a king, and if the king should act in a way that will forfeit that favor, then things are going to go very badly for him. And so the church plays a very prominent role in maintaining this sense that the king has God's grace, that the king is in God's favor, and continues to be the legitimate ruler, right? If the church pulls that, that's going to undermine the king in some significant ways that you want to avoid if possible. So these were things that could really limit the ability of kings to demand obedience and to really rule in any kind of a overly powerful fashion. Okay. As we get into the early modern period, as we cross, the generation around the year 1500, get into the 16th century, and especially start getting into the 17th century, in the 1600s, we've seen that both of these factors are shifting. On the church side, we already saw the Protestant Reformation, and that's going to really change things quite a bit. because now instead of having the church that you're dealing with, instead of having the Pope, you've now got a choice of churches on the menu. You've got a number of different options for the kind of Christianity you're going to have in your kingdom, and that is going to mean that kings become the decision makers, right? Is their kingdom going to become Protestant? Is it going to remain Catholic? Is it going to switch sides? And if you don't like what you're being told from the group of churchmen that you have the potential ability to get rid of them, exile them, burn them at the stake for heresy, whatever you're going to do, and bring in a set of churchmen from the other side who will then support you and maybe be more agreeable to letting you be king, to letting you rule. So the Protestant Reformation really shifts the balance of power between church and state more into the hands of the state, right, or more into the hands of the kings rather than the churchmen, because the churchmen are now much more at risk and vulnerable owing to the existence of more religious competition. So that's going to empower kings quite a bit. This gets encapsulated in a new phrase you start hearing, not so much king by the grace of God, that becomes less common. Instead, you are more often seeing in the documents and proclamations, king by divine right. Right, the divine right of kings comes to be stressed, which emphasizes not so much that God is having favor on somebody who doesn't necessarily deserve it, but more that this is something that the king can claim by right. It belongs to him, and nobody can challenge his right to kingship that God has granted to him. This kind of takes the ability of the church to criticize royal power, to challenge royal power out of the picture to a great extent. So that's on the religious side. When you take a look on the secular side, what's happening with the nobility, you may have picked up by now, the nobility is coming under pressure, right? They don't collapse, they don't disappear or anything like that, but their ability to maintain themselves at the top of the social ladder is eroding, right? They're losing some of those powers they used to presume. Gunpowder, as we saw, is one of them. Your castle walls are not much use against an army that has cannon. It is possible to build a fortification that can withstand cannon fire, but that's a lot more complicated than just putting up walls and towers around your home. That requires much more elaborate fortification processes that the average nobleman is not necessarily capable of doing. Um, Likewise, your horse, your knight in shining armor is not going to be a supreme force on the battlefield. Now a bunch of commoners with muskets can gun down the knights and their horses pretty easily, and so you lose that kind of, military supremacy there. Also, the merchant class is growing larger, is becoming wealthier. You're getting more and more trade, steadily growing over the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period. Towns and cities are getting bigger, markets are getting more important, there's just more money going around, and money means power, right? So the merchant classes in the towns are getting much more political clout. And that in turn is going to squeeze the nobles from above, where they are less and less, able to guarantee that they are going to have superior social standing to these commoners, right? So the nobles are feeling the squeeze kind of economically in that sense, as well as militarily. So they are also not going to be in such a strong position to defy kings from. Increasingly, they are going to be turning to kings, more likely to ally themselves with kings in hopes that the kings will buttress their social status, reinforce them, and help them to maintain their superiority over the commoners. Okay, so there's sort of this, both from the religious side, with the changes going on owing to the Protestant Reformation, and on the secular side, with things happening to the nobility, owing to gunpowder, owing to the rise of the merchant class. You've got quite a bit of change happening, which is taking away a lot of the old barriers to royal power. As a result, what you start seeing in the 16th century is the rise of a political ideology, sort of philosophy, of royal absolutism. The idea that the king's power is absolute, is supreme, does not have any limitations. The king can command whatever he wants, and nobody is supposed to be able to disobey him or defy him, not legitimately. And the king is answerable to nobody, right? There's nobody who could criticize the king or challenge him or hold him accountable for decisions, but rather the king answers only to God. Okay, so this is royal absolutist idea. You see it getting argued at law and in speeches that are being made and treatises that are being written. You've got one of them by Jean Domat in France, which is a great example of the type. with a number of different arguments. Divine right is one of them, that God makes the king king, and therefore the king rules basically with God's authority, and nobody can challenge that. And not even the church, right? Sort of the idea that we saw Henry IV expressing way back when that he received his authority directly from God too. That is back stronger than ever, and really much stronger even than Henry might have conceived of it. Like I say, removing this idea that the king can be criticized by the church or challenged by the church. So that's one major shift that's going on. There are other arguments that come from different directions. A lot of them are legal arguments. So, for example, if you think about how a king receives his kingdom, he receives it by inheritance. Okay, so the kingdom belongs under inheritance law, and the king's role in the kingdom, therefore, would be similar to the role of a property owner who has inherited a house or a farm from his father, right? So, this sort of argument by analogy will happen that conceives of the kingdom as a kind of property of the king, right? It's not a territory over which he has merely jurisdiction or lordship, but actually has actual ownership, right? And you can see that jurisdiction and ownership are two very different things, but this line of thinking would blend them together. So the king becomes the owner of the kingdom. And the implication of that would be just as a farmer can decide what crops he wants to plant on his farm, just as a homeowner can decide what color he wants to paint his house or how he wants to modify it or redecorate it or tear it down and build a new one if he wants to. Nobody can tell a property owner what to do with his own property. Likewise, nobody can tell a king what to do with his own kingdom. It's his, he owns it, nobody else has a claim on him over it, so it's under his total control in that same kind of a fashion. So that's one argument. There's another legal argument which draws on Roman law. Roman law had continued to be used, as law from the old Roman Empire, continued to be used through the Middle Ages for these thousands of years, was still being used in early modern Europe. They would add to it and modify it and do their own, national versions of it, and royal law and so forth. But still, you could point to Roman law for the basic principles of law that were in use. And one of those principles was something called patri potestas. Excuse me. Patri potestas, which is Latin for the authority of the father. Okay, paternal authority, the authority of a father in his household. The thing is, Roman law was extremely patriarchal. The ancient Roman household was under the complete control of the head of household, of the father figure, to the extent that nobody else in the house had legal, what we call legal personhood, legal responsibility for themselves. Nobody else in the household could go to court and claim rights in their own property, for instance. The sons of the father, certainly slaves were not servants in the household, even if they were not slaves, still were under the authority of the head of household. And their business was his business, and he represented them. They couldn't represent themselves in law. Sons of the family, men, even if they were of adult age, nevertheless remained under the guardianship of their father, the same as a child would be, until they moved out and set up households of their own, which enabled them to become, fathers of households in their own right. So you never got your independence unless you, formed this independence by literally getting out from under the roof. Women never got independence. Women were always wards under the guardianship of the head of the household. Normally, a girl would be under the guardianship of her father, and then when she got married, that guardianship might actually remain with her father, was one option, or it might transfer to her husband. But either way, she was under the authority of a man. And if her father and her husband both died, then a brother or an uncle or somebody would take it over. But there always had to be a male guardian over women, so they never, at law, moved beyond the same status a child would have in modern society, right? They always had to have a guardian responsible for their legal affairs. So anyway, this idea, patri potestas, says that the head of household has all legal authority over the business and the property of the household and all the people in it. None of them can make claims at law in their own name. Again, early modern lawyers pushing for absolutism would take this and argue this as an analogy that a king is father to his kingdom, right? The same way that a father in a household is father is head of his household. And therefore, just as a father has complete authority over his household, in the same way, a king has absolute authority over his kingdom. Okay, so an analogy working that way. Okay, so a number of different arguments could go on. It's not just divine right of kings. That tends to be the one that people talk about the most. But there's actually a lot of different arguments going on in order to support this idea of kings ruling by divine right. Okay, or sorry, of kings ruling absolutely. Like I said, divine right is just one of the arguments, but there's multiple arguments going on here. There's one other one that I should bring in, which is over the course of the 17th century, in the about 1650. While there's a civil war going on in England, an Englishman named Thomas Hobbes, like Calvin and Hobbes, the tiger in the cartoon is named for this guy. Um, Thomas Hobbes was interested in these questions of royal authority. He was a supporter of royal absolutism in England, which had just been defeated, and he's trying to say why that had been a very bad idea. We'll talk about that in the next video. And Hobbes, though, is influenced by these Enlightenment ideas that we spoke about in class, these ideas that to establish the truth of a matter, you don't look at tradition, you don't look at religion, you don't look at, history or just, what gets handed down by authority. So Hobbes didn't want to tackle this question by looking at divine right. He didn't want to go quoting the Bible. He didn't want to go appealing to ancient Roman law or anything like that. He wanted to try to figure out this question of royal authority in an Enlightenment fashion. So he wrote a book called Leviathan, which I've not given you to read, but recommend taking a look at some sections on it. It's easily findable. And what Hobbes argued in Leviathan is, if you imagine the human race in what he calls the state of nature, right? Human beings in nature before having formed any kind of a political society, right? And he's interested in the question, how do you get a political society? What's its purpose? What good does it do? And therefore, what form should it take? What is politics and authority and government for? Hobbes argues that in the state of nature, everybody is an individual, everybody's on their own, they're out for themselves, and therefore everybody has the same equal right. They have the right to do whatever they need to do to survive. Okay, fundamentally. And people, since resources are limited, everybody who has the right to survive equally with everybody else is going to be in competition with other people. There's a cantaloupe over there. I want the cantaloupe. You want the cantaloupe. We both have an equal right to the cantaloupe. Nobody can claim more of a right over it than the other person has, and therefore we're going to get into competition, and therefore we're going to get into conflict, right? So the human race in the state of nature, in Hobbes's view, is inherently always at war with itself, everybody at war with everybody else, as they all struggle for survival. Hobbes calls this the war of all against all, right? The sort of chaos, universal warfare, everybody constantly in conflict with everybody else. And therefore, Hobbes says that in the state of nature, human life is nasty, brutish, and short, right? Because we're all constantly fighting with each other and killing each other all the time. So Hobbes argues the state of nature is not a very happy situation for people to be in. It's a very pessimistic view of things. So Hobbes says, okay, if life in the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, because we're all in the war of all against all, how can you improve on that? How do people escape that situation and come up with something that will, enable them to live longer and have happier lives? And Hobbes argues that what happens is people form something called a social contract. What they do in a contract is they make a mutual agreement. I've got a right to the cantaloupe, you've got a right to the cantaloupe, the guy over there has a right to the cantaloupe, everybody's got their rights. But what we're all going to do is we're going to form an agreement that we're going to give up our separate individual rights to the cantaloupe. Right? We're going to, now you could do this just by giving up your right altogether, but what Hobbes says you do is you transfer your right. And what do? You transfer your right to somebody that you pick for a higher authority, who is then going to be able to establish rules among the group, which will enable us to decide who gets the cantaloupe or how we're going to share the cantaloupe, right? In other words, we form this agreement, we transfer our rights to a decision maker, to someone over us, an authority, who will establish rules that will allow all of us to get what we need in order to be able to survive, and we all agree to abide by these rules under the authority of whoever we set up over us, right? So the social contract creates a government and creates laws, right? The government creates laws, the government enforces the laws, makes sure everybody is following the rules that we set up for ourselves, and so you get the beginnings of political society, which then grows into, the kingdoms and states that we know today, right? So Hobbes's idea, government arises out of social contract between people who are equal by nature, but who agree to transfer their rights into the safekeeping, so to speak, of the government so that the government can end the war of all against all, maintain peace among people by the rule of law, and, guarantee the general welfare. So that's Hobbes's idea. What does this have to do with royal power and with absolutism? Well, in Hobbes's view, if the condition of entering the social contract, right? If there's sort of a condition you need to meet in order to join the social contract, that is, you must give up your right as an individual. You must give up your claim to have your individual ability to demand the cantaloupe for yourself, right? You have to transfer that to the authority, and the authority is going to decide, in which case you no longer have the right, right? You no longer hold it. The authority holds it for you, and ultimately, of course, that authority is going to be a king. So the king holds the authority, the king makes the rules, the king makes the decisions and establishes the judgments and enforces them for everybody. So the cost of it is that you now agree to accept an authority over yourself that you no longer have rights over against, right? You've given up your rights. You handed your rights over to the king. The king holds all the rights, and therefore you no longer have them, and that means the king is not somebody that you can sue or attack or rebel against. If you do so, you're out of the social contract, you're back out in the state of nature, you're back out in the war of everybody against everybody, or in this case, of you against everybody. You're a rebel against society. That's not a legitimate position to be in, and you are therefore wrong, or at least everybody else is justified in killing you or, making war against you and taking, anything you may try to be having, right? So for Hobbes, the condition of a peaceful, orderly, lawful society must be the absolute authority of the king. Okay, that's where he draws us. So it's a different way of getting at royal absolutism. Would be a very influential argument later on. In the next video, we'll see what John Locke does with it and how he draws different conclusions from some similar premises. Okay, so anyway, that's the theory. That's royal absolutism as a political philosophy, as a theory, right? Multiple different ways people get at it, not necessarily contradictory. These arguments all kind of reinforce each other. You could say religious argument, king rules by divine right. You can make legal arguments that the king rules as the owner of the kingdom, that the kingdom is the king's property, or that the king is the head of household and has the rights of a patriarchal authority over his kingdom, or you can argue by social contract that the king has all right and nobody has rights over against him because they have forfeited those rights as the cost of entering the social contract, right? That's all in theory, right? That's all among the intellectuals and the people at courts who are writing the speeches and the proclamations and, writing treatises on behalf of kings to explain, sort of flatter kings and tell them why they get to be so powerful. The question then is, what about practice? Right? How does this all transfer over into kings actually being able to issue orders, actually being able to decree that he's going to collect taxes or make war against somebody and recruit soldiers and all the other things that, the king may want to do in the course of his government? How does the king actually get things to work in his kingdom in an absolute fashion? And this turns out to be a lot more difficult, naturally, and never really happens completely 100% on the ground. You never truly have an absolute monarch who rules fully absolutely. Probably the most successful, or the one who kind of comes to represent the type to people later on, is Louis XIV, who was king of France starting back in the 1640s. He succeeds the throne already. He's just a child when his father dies. Takes the throne in the 1640s and continues to rule all the way down to 1714 or something like that. A very, very long rule of about 70 years. Like I say, becomes a king as a child, lives into old age. And just his personality and his absolutist way of ruling sort of becomes the norm, right? That's going to set the way that people are going to rule in subsequent generations, or the way that people will attempt to or look back to as what they think is the absolutist style. And kings in other kingdoms like Spain and elsewhere will try to imitate this absolute style of rule that Louis brings in. In Louis's case, what's going on in France, you can use the exemplar. There's a number of things he has to deal with. The nobles, you may remember, are under pressure from gunpowder and from the merchant class, but they don't disappear, right? The nobles are still very powerful. Their power is eroding, they're losing ground, they're getting nervous, but they haven't disappeared, and they are still very wealthy and very powerful people, especially in the localities where they have their estates, where they still have castles, no, not so militarily relevant anymore, but they still have castles and estates and palaces. Um, they still have networks of supporters that depend on them and that they protect and provide for. And there's, nobles are very, very powerful individuals on the ground still in the locations. So if the king is going to be able to rule absolutely, he's got to do something about the nobles, right? And there's two different approaches you can take. One is to try to bypass the nobles, make them irrelevant, right? And that's one of the things you'll see the absolutist monarchs doing, do an end run around the nobles. So a couple of things you could do here. One, you build up a royal bureaucracy, a royal administration that's able to get things done. Royal law courts, royal tax collection agencies, royal archives, things like that, right? This whole sort of royal bureaucracy, which you can then staff with commoners, right? You don't have to have nobles to run this kind of a thing. You can staff this with commoners and therefore get the machinery of power going. And has nothing to do with what the nobles were up to. And this has already begun back in the Middle Ages, the sort of steady growth of royal administration and central government. That had been going on already for a couple hundred years. It continues and intensifies and becomes even more prominent as you get into the early modern period. And this allows you to tap into the talent of the commoners, the talents of the merchant class, put them in government jobs, give them positions of power and influence in this bureaucracy, and you're going to be able to do that. Another aspect of this is you can actually use this to create new nobles loyal to yourself, to sort of water down the authority of the old nobles who might not be so reliable. In France, they call this the noblesse du robe, where the robe is the judge's robe, the symbol of a judge's authority. And by going to the university, getting a degree, studying law, becoming a judge, the judges wear these elaborate robes, and this kind of marks somebody as a new kind of a noble. You'll actually get noble titles going with it, where these people who have sort of risen through the ranks by merit and education wind up becoming rivals in power to the old nobles whose power was based on their ownership of land and their hereditary connections. So you could sort of build up a nobility that way, sort of a new nobility. And not only can you build up a new nobility through service, you can even just go out and outright sell noble titles, right? The merchants, they're ambitious, they want to rise, they want to climb the ladders. They don't like the idea of some guy who has a title that he's gotten by heredity outranking them and being able to, be a snob and, snub them. So you get lots of wealthy nobles who are thrilled at the idea that the king might give them what's called a patent of nobility, right? The patent being a document granting noble status, granting a noble title like Count or Duke or something to somebody who didn't have it by heredity. You can actually just buy these things. These things become royal, source of royal revenues. Where if you don't want to impose taxes on people, nobody likes paying taxes. Instead, you can offer them something they want for sale. You can offer them prestige, give them a patent of nobility, and then they get to go around, calling their house a castle and going around being the duke of something or other, and they sort of feel, prouder and can strut down the street with this higher status that they got from the king. So these patents of nobility, kind of a nouveau riche, a new, rich, high-status group of people rising in the kingdoms, you wind up with thousands of these things being sold, lots and lots of money being raised by kings, and thousands of new people suddenly showing up, kind of swamping the old hereditary nobility with all their new fancy titles. So that's, one dimension. That will get you so far. Right, that will get you a certain amount of, building up a body of people who are working for you as a king and getting your will done on the ground, because that's what they get paid to do and that's what they get their noble titles for, and they'll serve you out of ambition. That builds up a more absolute basis of your power in practice. Won't get you all the way, because the fact is people still know the hereditary nobles are the hereditary nobles. There's still that sense of this is the old blood, these are the old families, these are, the power doesn't just disappear necessarily, and they still have an awful lot of wealth, an awful lot of land that people are, peasants are working on and things that are dependent on them. So this doesn't make the old nobility just become completely powerless just by bypassing them in these ways. So the other thing that an absolute monarch will do is co-opt the noble. right? Try to get them on board and cooperating with the royal agenda rather than resisting it. If the king wants taxes raised in your duchy or your county, then he will get the duke or the count to cooperate collecting those taxes and putting his weight behind it rather than putting weight against it and resisting it and potentially creating problems that way. So this is the other thing that kings tend to do, and they've got some advantages here. Because, of course, the nobles are nervous. The nobles are competing with the merchants. They're competing with these guys in the royal bureaucracy. They're competing with wealthy noblemen, with wealthy merchants living in their own towns, and the marketplace is getting rich and, having almost as much money or more money than some of the nobles have. So the nobles are really looking for any way they can keep their heads above water, and they're willing to trade cooperation with the king if the king will in turn give them something that will give them an edge, right? Something that will allow them to keep their heads above water, remind people that they've got privileges that other people don't have. And kings are willing to do this with them, right? It's kind of a playing one side off, playing the merchants against the nobles against the merchants. At the same time as you are promoting merchant class people into your government bureaucracy and helping them rise the ranks and selling titles of nobility to them. On the other hand, you're also turning around and you're granting certain legal privileges and exemptions and rights to nobles that commoners don't get. Right, so the king is handing out these various marks of status and sometimes very practical benefits to nobles that they're not giving to the merchants, even to the merchants that are buying patents of nobility, and that helps the nobles, retain their sense of being at the top of the ladder and not feeling, getting completely overwhelmed by the rising power of the merchant class. It may be things like only the nobles have the right to hunt in a royal forest. It may be exemptions from certain laws or exemptions from certain taxes, things like that. All these sort of package of benefits, a whole miscellaneous bunch of things, which collectively spare nobles a bunch of expenses, grant them the abilities to do various things that the merchants can't do, and overall just sort of helps to keep the nobles feel like they're being marked out as a superior group of people. And that sort of brings the nobles on board and makes them, more willing to cooperate with what you're doing so that they don't just disappear, in competition with merchants. So that's a dimension there. Finally, one last aspect of this co-opting of the nobles is you create sort of status environments, places where you can bring the nobles where they can, demonstrate their higher status, demonstrate their higher privilege and their greater prestige. Again, Louis XIV is the greatest example of this. It's a great era in the 17th century for palace building. People build palaces all over the place. These palaces are far bigger than the old medieval palaces used to be. A lot of time the medieval palaces get torn down to build these things in their place, or you build a whole new one out in the suburbs or something. But palaces going up, different from castles. Palaces are not fortifications, right? It's not just a home or a hall that's been fortified. It's a large, elaborate building with ballrooms and audience halls and, salon rooms where people to sort of meet and socialize in, and, kitchens and dining areas and all this very elaborate sort of thing. Beautiful, luxurious, highly decorated, filled with servants, totally unnecessary numbers of servants beyond what you actually need, but just there to sort of, hover on your every whim. A supreme example is Louis XIV's palace at Versailles, outside of Paris. It used to be an old hunting lodge. He builds it up in this enormous, elaborate, glittering gold and silver and mirrored work of architecture. And it becomes a place where you can hold events and celebrations at and hold court at. You invite the nobles to. Getting an invitation to Versailles is a huge boost to your prestige over against, somebody who does not get an invitation to Versailles. And then once in that kind of environment, all sorts of little nitpicky things that in a sense don't really cost the king anything. Who gets to sit where at the table? Who gets to be in the room when the king wakes up and gets dressed? Or there when he goes to bed at night. Sort of, who the king plays cards with. Just all this little stuff that seems like it has no practical significance whatsoever, but it symbolizes prestige. It symbolizes status. Cost the king absolutely nothing to rearrange the seating order at the dining table. But what it does is allows the king to reward people who are supporting him and that are in his favor, and to punish people that are resisting him or that are causing problems so that, they'll be less likely to do that. Huge humiliation if somebody gets moved up to the table ahead of you, and that might make you rethink, what you've been doing, if you've been, defying the king's wishes or something. So this environment, you could sort of use the prestige and the glamour to lure the nobility into these palaces, and then they get there, they're engaged in the social life of the palace, and then all these little manipulations allow you to sort of maintain control on the nobles, and that becomes a very significant dimension of how royal absolutism is going to work as well. Okay, so that's sort of an overview of royal absolutism. I'll stop here and do another video that I'll put on YouTube to talk about limited monarchy and how that compares. Thanks.